Our next speaker is Andrew Blum. He's actually going to come up and talk about the handmade internet. He has a book out which most of you may have heard of. It's called Tubes, A Journey to the Center of the Internet. If you haven't read that, I think it's a good read for everybody here, and maybe if you're lucky, there might be something in it for somebody here, right? So please stand by.
Hi, good morning. I think I count as the entertainment, so we'll try to do that. Thanks to Tom for the invitation. Thanks as well for Telex for sort of sponsoring my talk, and also for buying a whole box load of books, of copies of Tubes, which you can grab during lunch and if you want, if you like what you hear. They're free though, so the bar is pretty low for how much you like it. I started working on this about 6 years ago now, 7 years ago, 2008. The world was pretty different. You had Blackberries, maybe you had an iPhone, you'd just gotten it. Netflix had just started streaming, the iTunes Store was relatively new. The iPad didn't exist. I was writing mostly about architecture at the time, about buildings, what that meant was that what I thought it meant, what I hoped it meant, was that I was going out into the world and looking at buildings and talking about who built them and how they got there and all of that. What it meant more was that I was sitting in front of my screen and people were emailing me pictures of buildings and I wasn't getting out much. And even worse, suddenly when I was getting out, I had completely changed the way I walked down the street. I now walk down the street with my head down looking at my iPhone. And that was entirely new. We had all started this new way of interacting with the world that now has become completely pervasive, but at the time still felt pretty fresh. What was frustrating to me was that if I was supposedly professionally engaged with the physical world, I was living now almost entirely in the virtual world. I was sitting at my desk, I was looking at screens. My attention was completely divided between the world inside the world in my screen and the world all around me. And that didn't make much sense because if you look at the world physically, the world inside the screen seemed to be not a world at all. It seemed to have no physical embodiment at all. When I went to say, okay, what does this mean? This is a bit of an existential crisis. Like, how can I know who I am if I don't know what it is that I'm connected to? If I don't know what it is, if I don't know who it is that I'm connected to, and if I don't know who it is that's making these connections and building these networks. I don't know if you know any of those people, but how could I sort of figure this out? What could I find a picture of the internet? What was it? And this was the main picture of the internet. This was kind of the only picture of the internet. It's an amorphous blob. I don't think you're really supposed to, like each strand does signify a network. This is the Opti's image. But I don't really think you're supposed to be able to find yourself on it. I think you're just kind of supposed to be in awe of its extent. You're supposed to kind of look at it and say, oh my God, what a miracle. It reminds me in that way of the Apollo blue marble picture of the Earth. I think it's a very kind of similar kind of thing and meant to say something very similar. But it just didn't seem right that there weren't pictures of the internet out there. I remember having a conversation with my editor at Wired magazine where I was writing for the time, and he was in New York and I was in San Francisco, and we said, we know how the internet works. It just kind of gets broken into bits and goes lots of different ways. And I realized that by saying it went lots of different ways, we were kind of saying it went no way at all. That it just kind of happened, that we didn't really have a way to engage with understanding where the internet was or how it was put together, or for my purposes, what it was, what it looked like, what buildings it was sitting in. And it just wasn't talked about very much at all. Then one day this happened. And my internet at home broke, and I've told this story a lot of times since. I still like telling the story. The cable guy came to fix it and followed the clump of wires from behind my couch out to the back of my building, and then sort of looked around and looked up and said something that effectively changed my life. which was that a squirrel is chewing on your internet. It never gets old. And it was astonishing because the squirrel, again, was that amorphous blob. The squirrel was an amorphous blob. The internet was an amorphous blob. The internet wasn't something that squirrels could chew on, and yet that was in fact what had happened. A squirrel had chewed on my internet. But I quickly realized that if a squirrel could chew on that piece of the internet, there had to be other pieces of the internet that squirrels can chew on. I don't know if any of you specifically had that problem, but there had to be something there. And the very clear image that I got was just to yank the cable from the wall. If you yanked the cable from the wall, where would it go? Who would you find? Why was it there? Who put it there? Who owns it? Who's selling it? What's going on? And that's what I started to do. I started to follow the cable. But as soon as I kind of, again, said, OK, there must be something there, what would happen? I started to then feel a little bit stupid about the whole thing. Because only fools went to look for the internet. Do I even need to tell you what this is? I think it's the episode of South Park where the internet breaks and they become internet refugees. So they go to California because that's where the internet is. Assorted things happen in the interim, but then finally they come to this place. This is the internet. And they do all they can to get it to work. They play the Close Encounters of the Third Kind music at it, and that doesn't work. They shoot at it, and that doesn't work. And then finally, one of the little guys climbs up and unplugs it and plugs it back in. And then the flashing yellow light is blinking green, salvation, the internet's saved. But this made me feel pretty stupid, that this was what the internet was meant to be. And this was, going to look for it was a bit of a joke. There was nothing to see there, if it existed at all. And if it did exist at all, it was probably just in California in one spot. Partly true, I suppose. Or if it wasn't fools looking for the internet, it was the kind of marketing equivalent, I guess. I love this. I do not know the answer to this question. I guess both is the correct answer. But it's indicative, I mean, yes, if there's a big storm, that could interfere with your cloud computing, but no, cloud computing does not happen in clouds, theoretically. But it indicated to me that kind of all our ways of talking about this are broken, that we don't really have a way to sort of think about how the physical connects to the logical, how the thing on our screen and all the layers upon layers of systems interact to create this thing that we are now umbilically connected to constantly, all the time, sort of buzzing on our bodies in different ways. The one guy who seemed to know what was going on, the one guy who seemed to have a way of talking about this, was the late Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, who said in 2006, not 1995, but 2006, that the internet is not something, sorry, let me get the quote right. The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes. And we laughed, and this was preposterous. And you can probably find the emails somewhere deep in your archive of sending this around. And he was lost in the past. This was not the way we talk about it. And he was at the time chair of the Senate Technology, Science, and Something Committee. But it seemed kind of right. It seemed like, okay, well, what if you did just look at it this way? What if you did just think about it as a series of tubes? And start to explore it purely in its physical manifestations, then what would you find? And that's what I set out to do. And I ended up in places like this. This was a photograph taken by a photographer named Randall Mesden, most famous previously for photographing then Marky Mark for Calvin Klein ads, but also did a photo essay for Wired about the places of the internet that I produced. And this is a fiber regen hut in the middle of Kansas, and it came out of a conversation with a press person at the time was Global Crossing, now Level 3, who had gotten on the phone. Well, I had said, okay, there's cables across the country. What happens to them? How does that work? And she got on the phone a tech in Kansas City, with a white pickup truck responsible for managing all the regen huts in a 500-mile radius. And then I started to ask which was the most beautiful fiber optic regen hut, and this was the winner. and other than that aesthetic quality, though, it changed the way that I was going to do this. I said that rather than chasing the bits, rather than sort of following the path, rather than saying, okay, if I send an email from point A to point B, how does it go? You know, how do you follow it? What happens? I was going to flip it upside down. I was going to stay in one spot, and I was going to watch the bits go by. And I was going to figure out what that one spot meant and why it was there and how it got there. And to do that, I was going to, and I know this is a bit scandalous, but I was going to abandon the logical. I was going to say, forget the logical. I was going to just leave it aside. And instead, I was going to focus on the physical and what these networks and what this infrastructure was made of. And I was going to focus on the geographic, on where it is and why it got there. And that uncovers a whole other level, a whole other category of stories. When I was talking to engineers and visiting data centers, I would often say I'm interested in layer 0 to layer 2.5 or layer 3. You kind of lose me. Like, I'm not going to worry about that. But within those layers, there were going to be stories to tell about places like this. This is another of Randall's photographs. 60 Hudson Street in New York, among the most connected buildings in the world. Most notably because of the undersea cables that land on the coast in Long Island, New Jersey, and then home run here. An old Western Union building, an old telegraph building, but with a bit of a discontinuous telecommunications history. It wasn't until the breakup of the Bell system that this became the beachhead for the independent networks of the internet to then interconnect back into the old legacy system. But remarkable first in that it just about this time, and in some ways with this image, began to be talked about as an important node on the internet. Not a secret place anymore, but a place that was going to be acknowledged as a major meeting point. And that was a pretty big transition in the way that this conversation was happening. Whereas before it was fully the Fight Club mentality of the first rule of data centers, the first rule of the internet is we don't talk about the internet, and that started to kind of open up a bit, which means that it made me quite comfortable saying things like that I would say there are about a dozen buildings in the world that are the most important places where the networks of the internet meet with each other. And they're mostly in places that you would expect in world capitals, in New York and Frankfurt and London and Tokyo, but then with some classic sort of internet outliers, the most notable being Palo Alto and Ashburn, Virginia. Ashburn, Virginia not being a major world capital, but perhaps it is for you, right? It's not even an incorporated city. But when I started talking to network engineers, of course, Ashburn was the phrase uttered most frequently. And that was interesting. That was something I, at the time, couldn't look up on Wikipedia. That was something at the time. The relative importance of these places was not acknowledged. It wasn't very clear. It was pre-peering DB. The relative importance of how many networks connect in each place and why one building is more important than another. Those stories had not yet been told. And it's been exciting to see both the way those stories are being told and even more remarkably, the consequences and the stakes of telling and not telling those stories, of not talking about which places are important and why they're important. And I'll get to that a little bit more. If not 60 Hudson Street, then this building. Have all of you been inside this building? Has anyone not been inside this building? Okay, that's kind of amazing. Okay. You probably have more stories about it than I do. But yeah, 350 Cermak in Chicago. Which is Chicago's home of the internet, world's largest data center, all the accolades, but was again remarkable that this is sort of acknowledged, that we sort of say, okay, this is the place where the networks in the Midwest meet, and there might be others, but this is really the one that comes out on top, and that's no longer a secret if it ever was. And I guess there's some stories about USA Today articles and stuff like that let the secret out. But this was always my favorite room. I've always been against blinking lights. The blinking lights are fun, but this is really where I get excited. This is the fiber vault, big interconnection point in Virginia. For me, this was always the best part of the tour. You wandering around cold, loud place, and then you open the door to the fiber vault, and it's hot, and it's quiet, and it smells like dirt, because this is where the fiber comes out of the ground. And for me, that connection between the virtual infrastructure, between the internet, between this cloud or data world or whatever you want to call it that we live in all the time, and the kind of geologic crust of the earth happens in this room. This is where it connects. But even more remarkably, it's connected by somebody. My sort of most striking observation walking through these places and clearest memory were the people hunched over their laptops in cages looking really annoyed because something wasn't working. You guys don't know anything about that. Right. And the recognition that when two networks connect, they connect because somebody has plugged in a cable at some point. And then in that sense, it's handmade. In that sense, it's made by individual people. And the recognition that there are decisions, both commercial and personal behind that, and relationships behind that, was a big part of the sort of recognition that the internet doesn't just come out of the sky, but in fact has a very specific story attached to it. But if it's handmade, if it's very specific and individual in these individual pieces, then how is it also global? And the undersea cables were irresistible, continue to be irresistible. This is another Randall's photographs that comes out of a similar conversation with, okay, if there are cables across the ocean, then what happens when they land on the beach? Is there a manhole or something? Yes. Okay, which is the most beautiful manhole? And this is the most beautiful manhole on the East Coast. There are contenders in California, but this is Hibernia Atlantic's manhole outside of Halifax. And was important to me because the cables are a little difficult to grasp because they're, in one level they're as thick as garden hoses. They're kind of, you can hold a piece of one in your hand. And the other way, they go into the water and they go for thousands of miles, and that's almost impossible for us to conceive. And we conceive of that distance flying, but we don't conceive of that distance along a single cable. And so I wanted to try to figure out, okay, well, how to get more in touch with what's actually going on here, how to get in touch with the handmade part of these globe spanning connections. Simon was my ticket. Simon Cooper, some of you may know, who at the time was working for Tata, which at the time was building a lot of cables. And he said, let me look. And it was like Guam, or it was going to be Africa. It was going to be places that were tricky to get to. And then on a Thursday, he called and said, if you can get to Portugal by Monday at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, this guy will walk out of the water. Which is what he did. He was a part of a Spanish underwater construction team. It's the WAX cable, West Africa cable system, being built by Alcatel-Lucent. He started with a lightweight nylon rope, a kind of messenger line, and a little skiff brought him up on shore. And he walked out of the water in his wetsuit, and they tied it to a bulldozer. And then the skiff drove it out to this cable laying ship. This wasn't the whole stretch. This was just the shore piece. They had to do it before the beach season started in this kind of dusty village outside of Lisbon. A lot of activity that week. You could see the Alcatel-Lucent engineers, the British engineers, keeping a close eye on things. They floated the cable, they brought it into shore, floated on these buoys. When it was in position, the underwater construction guy got back in the water with a machete and cut the buoys off. And the buoys pop up in the air, and the cable drops to the ocean floor. And he does that the whole kilometer out to the beach, out to the boat. Then when he gets there, they give him a glass of juice and a cookie. And he jumps back in the water, swims the kilometer back to shore, steps out and lights a cigarette. And then you have your shore end, at least on the beach, and then you have to start getting ready to connect it to the part that comes down from the cable landing station, the lighthouse. And to do that, you have to remove the steel mesh that surrounds it, because sharks. And then remove the steel mesh, you have to take a hacksaw. and so here we have, I'm sitting here watching them hack away at this cable. There's like a really good cafe right next to the manhole, and the local Tata, the guy who's managed the cable landing station, was basically sitting on the patio of this cafe, alternating between beer and espresso over the course of like 12 hours. So they're hacking away at this cable, and the fish delivery is coming. Like the fishermen are like throwing fish on the step of the kitchen door, and suddenly the internet doesn't really seem much like a cloud at all. It seems like, when you see them going at it with a hacksaw, it starts to get really real. But what else could it be, right? It has to be real like that. Even at its biggest stretches, there have to be these moments of physical connection. And they're not so new, right? I mean, you're talking, regardless of the fiber optic technology, regardless of the, forward error correction and the algorithms and the sort of constant increase in transmission rates, and the kind of the basic miracle of a 10 gigabit per second, much less 100 gig wave times how many waves in the cable. Call it 50, 60, 100 gigabit per second waves in one of maybe 5 fiber pairs. We're talking, of course, about terabits of information going thousands of miles through something the size of a garden hose. But the tradition's pretty long. The tradition's 150 years old, of the British engineers in the background overseeing things, of the day laborers. In Portugal, they were Somali. In this picture from the 20s in Hong Kong, it's different. They, doing the heavy lifting and building the internet and getting this thing done. And not only that, but the places are the same. The cables still trace the sort of same trading paths between major port cities, between Amsterdam, London, New York, Mumbai. This is Telegeography's map. How many of you have this on your office wall? No, not that many. Okay, not your office wall, your bedroom wall. Right. The Telegeography is TC-based market research and sort of cartography company, and they put out the submarine cable map every year. They also now have a great digital version. And I spent a lot of time with Marcus Crucecha, who's the cartographer, who in the last couple of years has started recognizing that it needn't be all high tech, like that in fact the sort of the tone of these cables didn't have to be rendered all in kind of black and red and high tech fonts, but instead could have some tradition with it. And so this year's submarine cable map is particularly kind of like Darby Dragons, right? It's particularly sort of invokes the long history of these cables and the strange history that continues. I don't know. I mean, whenever a cable breaks, there's always this flurry of news. I mean, there were the sharks last year. There was the strange Facebook post by the Egyptian police announcing that 3 men were arrested trying to sever a cable off the coast of, I guess it was Cairo. And the only, this was global news. It was a great story. The only source for this news that anyone ever found was, in fact, this Egyptian police Facebook post. It seems a little suspicious. I mean, the cables have tens of thousands of volts going through them. It's not really clear who cuts them and why. It's always a bit hyped. The only one thing that's really clear about who cuts them are earthquakes. There's some great stories about major multiple cuts following underwater earthquakes. I don't know how many of you were up late in 2000. When was Luzon? 2007, I guess, with the earthquake off Taiwan that basically cut off Asia from the internet. But if we don't sort of recognize and don't sort of come to ground with the fact that these cables exist, that they are attached, then what happens with something like this is the flurry of activity over 3 or 4 days ends. They put the manhole cover back on. They push the sand over it. This village goes back to the way it was. The manhole, the engineers who are responsible for it know where it is, but otherwise all of us forget about it. And we don't worry about it anymore. It just kind of works. There's the great Neil Stephenson line that wired people should know something about wires. When the manhole's covered, I think we start to lose that. It seems like kind of a shame. It seems like well, yes, there might be obvious reasons to cover this particular manhole. More often than not, the need to know about the infrastructure and how it works there's a greater imperative for that than there is a security need to keep it secret. And we see that again and again. I mean, the cables, and specifically the biggest threat to cables, are ship anchors. And so in fact, the International Cable Protection Committee spends all of their effort telling people where the cables are rather than hiding where they are to make sure that anchors don't go over them. And that kind of, that back and forth between, okay, which of this is secret, which of this do we absolutely not talk about, and which of this are we made better for sort of knowing how it works and how it fits together, has been a somewhat, an absolutely astonishing conversation to watch over the last 3 or 4 years. When I think about what the conversation was like in 2008 versus what the conversation is like now, it's pretty remarkable the extent to which internet infrastructure has become recognized and has as an issue and has become recognized as having stakes, as not just being something that we don't worry about, that we let the engineers worry about, but as something that affects all of us. I started to see that in the kind of third part of my journey to the internet. I kind of divided the internet into 3 sort of anatomical parts. The places where networks meet, the internet exchanges, the lines in between, the undersea and terrestrial cables, and then finally the data centers, the places where data is stored. Obviously sometimes those categories overlap, but at the extremes they're pretty distinct. This picture I took in the woods behind Facebook's data center in Prineville, Oregon. These were the new power lines that were brought in to feed that data center. Now I've lost track of how many they're up to. 3 buildings, 4 buildings. Kind of amazing ongoing growth. You know, 1 aircraft carrier size building after another. But remarkable for being a monument, for no longer just kind of being a place that doesn't have a sign and that we're going to ignore and not talk about, but instead is going to be shown off. And for me, originally as an architecture writer, and recognizing that buildings say things, that buildings stand for things, and buildings somehow embody the ideas of the people who built them, it was pretty surprising to see that Facebook was going to turn their infrastructure into an image. Was going to say, okay, we're going to talk about it. Pretty much anyone who wants to come see it can come see it, and we're going to make it beautiful. Although the engineers who worked in this building really didn't like it, so I guess that divide is still going to be there. And that went all the way down to the not just the blinking lights, but the blinking blue lights, and that kind of sense that this is where your stuff is. And this began to replace that amorphous blob as one of the major images of the internet. This is now what the internet looks like, for better or for worse. But was in really striking contrast, that impulse to say, okay, we're gonna show this off. We're going to say this is a core part of what we do, was in really striking contrast with the other major data center down the road in Oregon, which was Google's data center in the Dalles, which was Google's first ground-up data center, was kept very secret for years. First time they actually built something, first recognition that these data centers would be sort of factories in some ways, and so secret, in fact, that this is no longer the Google Maps image, but for a long time this was the Google Maps satellite image of Google's data center in the Dalles. It's not an outdated image, it's a scrubbed out image. They had erased themselves from the maps. I mean, first rule of geography is, those who make the maps have the power. In this case, Google had erased its data center from its own map. When I went to visit there, my visit sort of it kind of played out as farce. I had been to dozens of data centers in different pieces of the internet and had talked to over 100 engineers in different categories. Almost all of you had a clear sense of why this was worth talking about. At Google, it was the opposite. It was don't worry about it, we'll take care of this for you. And so my tour consisted of a tour of the parking lot, and our destination was their organic garden, but it was winter, so it was kind of like, here's our patch of dirt. It was surprising. Clearly my hopes of getting in this building weren't going to happen, and still the only pictures there is this famous set of pictures of inside of Google's data centers that were published in Wired but photographed by Google. later discovered to be photoshopped. I don't know if you saw some of that, sort of mirrored in different ways. The extent of Google as an outlier in my kind of travels was really remarkable. And equally remarkable given this sort of sensation of Google eating the internet in some way or another. This was my surreptitiously photographed sort of prison shot as I was driving out of the data center in the Dalles. And began for me to sort of realize what, we have access to all this information, and what do we know about how this works, and who controls that access to this information, and what's gained from knowing how it fits together. That, of course, became much more dramatic, and the stakes got much higher almost exactly 2 years ago. This is Trevor Paglen's image of the NSA headquarters in Fort Meade. It was taken with the cooperation of the NSA. He rented a helicopter, sort of said, I'm going to be flying over it to photograph it. Essentially out of everyone's exasperation that after a year and a half of articles about the NSA, the same stock image was being used again and again and again. And with the idea that, that this photograph, that we had to have a better image of what the NSA was and looked like in order to talk about it. And so this was taken and put in the public domain, free to download at any size. It doesn't even have to be acknowledged. So a real effort to sort of say, okay, if we're going to have this conversation, then we at least need pictures for it. I went to print out my notes this morning at the computer in the lobby of the Hilton, I made a PDF, and this would be pretty straightforward, and stuck in my thumb drive, hit print. It was 8 pages, and the first 6 pages popped out, and the 7th pages it stopped, and it said offending image, and I said, that's strange. I must have exceeded my Hilton allocated allotment, and so did it again, and on a different computer, and the same thing happened, and I have no idea what that means, but it printed 7 pages and then stopped at this image. Is that at all possible? I mean, there are 30 slides down the page, and then it stopped at this image, which was quite strange. But again, it starts to have talking about these things starts to have consequences. This is a few weeks ago. This is about telephones, not about the internet. But for what used to be the first rule of data centers is we don't talk about data centers, now is the subject of very specific inquiries. I had an interesting time looking at some of the German testimony the other day about DKIX, about the Frankfurt Exchange, that has then sort of is now at the center of conversation in the German inquiry into their own tapping, into NSA tapping. And then, of course, again, this is by no means settled. It's by no means, it's only one specific thing. But the conversation is happening, the sort of recognition that we kind of need to know what's inside the box. We need to know how these things work, that there are both commercial and personal and political consequences to knowing how these things work becomes more and more important. Or, again, not at all settled, but as I'm sure some of you have been very intimately involved with in different ways, interconnection was not part of the conversation until very recently. Interconnection was not mentioned in the context of net neutrality. This is Tim Wu who coined the term net neutrality, but the word peering does not appear in his book about net neutrality. It just wasn't there. It wasn't part of the conversation. That certainly is no longer the case. It now is, and I don't know if this appears in your lives as a kind of frustration or as a kind of excitement, because it might be a shift away from a duopoly in some way or another. I know the Midwest is a kind of hotbed of independent ISPs in a lot of ways. I'd be curious to hear more about some of those. But again, knowing about the infrastructure is having consequences in a way that 6 years ago, 8 years ago, really not since the broadband bust that has been the case. And it's being talked about in different ways. This is hot off the presses, or maybe it's at the printer now. It's by an artist named Ingrid Burrington, who has actually produced this book, A Field Guide to Internet Infrastructure in New York. So you can then take it and walk around New York and look at the markings on the ground and get little descriptions of all the major internet buildings, none of which still have signs on them, but this is a completely different way of talking about this rather than the sort of lore in some way or another. And then this is my sort of my, I don't know, dream might be a little overstating it, but one kind of vision for how this could end up. This is the Bonneville Dam. Has anyone been to the Bonneville Dam? It's down the road from the Dalles, from Google's data center there. It's an Army Corps of Engineer project. It's heavily fortified. When you drive into it, you go through a kind of tunnel through a mountain. There's an Army Corps of Engineer guard who checks your trunk and then says, come on in. And then once you get inside, there's an interpretive center and a gift shop and a fish ladder, so you can kind of watch the salmon sort of jump upstream. And there's no question that this is a sensitive piece of infrastructure, but we've kind of found a way to make it public after a long history of the dam's social consequences and jobs in the region, environmental consequences, and all sorts of things. We found a way to kind of have a sort of brewery-style tour of this infrastructure. I don't know if that means that what's to come are sort of brewery-style tours of internet infrastructure. I am still waiting for the day. I was so excited with the Google barges because I thought that's what it was going to be. It didn't happen. But I think that we are sort of getting closer to the recognition that this infrastructure needs an image, it needs pictures, we need to understand how it works, we need to understand who makes it, and we need to understand sort of how it all fits together. Whether those stakes are for your business cloud or whether those stakes are a question of government overreach or whether they're commercial interests in other ways. And I think that's that's the arc that we're on at the moment, at a really interesting moment. And again, take any slice of it. The three examples of Google antitrust in Europe, NSA, net neutrality, all very active conversations and all very open questions about how this is going to evolve. And that's really interesting for me. So the last piece, you've been promised a film about Chicago. Now, all of you have been to 350 East Cermak. One of the things that I've been doing, in addition to kind of tracking the ways in which the stakes for the internet infrastructure have changed, has been to help tell the stories about internet infrastructure. And so I worked with Telex at a video production company to do a 3-minute piece about the Meet Me room at 350 Cermak. That sort of, I don't know, how many of you have you been inside the Meet Me room? So all of you have been inside the building, but none of you have been inside the Meet Me room? A few people. Okay, sorry. All right. So tell some of that story. Now we're gonna dim the lights. Okay. And I have to very elegantly switch to QuickTime while hoping the sound works. Are you ready? All right. How are we on sound here? Does anybody hear it clicking? I don't know if we have sound. Let's see. Oh, maybe we do. Okay. Okay. So I should say, we 3 minutes, and then we'll do. We can do questions. We have time for questions, and then we can do books too. Okay. Nobody has seen this.
One of the key locations networks connect is in large data centers or large carrier hotels. 350 East Cermak, being one of the largest, is where all networks connect in Chicago. You have dozens and dozens of network providers in one location, which you don't find in a lot of buildings. Now that they're in that location, how do they connect to each other? Those networks may be there, but until they touch one another, they really aren't connected. Until that cross-connect takes place, they're just standalone networks. At the heart of this building is the media room that Telex runs, and that's where all of these providers and exchanges, etc., connect to one another.
Every floor in the building has a tie into the media room. You're less than 70 feet away from anybody that you need to connect to. Everybody is in one place. So it provides the ability to connect network A to network Z within one building. And it comes down to that one cable, whether it be fiber, whether it be coax, whether it be a copper connection via Cat 5 or Cat 6. It comes down to making that connection between the two networks. You have to have that physical layer in place.
Certainly the advantage to our customers in that we run the meeting room means that we can literally get to anyone, not just within the meeting room, but within the building. We have the rights to connect to anyone in the building. No matter where you are housed in this building, your connections will run into the meeting room and Telex will run that process for you. We call it the simplest, most complex product in the world of interconnection.
That last piece is critical to business. That last piece has to be done if they can't communicate. And that's what it's all about. Being able to communicate one business to another. That's what the network is all about. It's all about communication.
It's pretty exciting to understand whether someone's making an electronic trade or posting something on social media or just searching the web, that they can't do any of that without what's going on in our media room.
And I can answer, I think we do have a few minutes before lunch for Q&A, yeah? 10 minutes, yeah.
I don't know if this is covered in your book, but is it either in the book or have you thought about writing more about how the geography, topography, and politics of the world end up influencing where cables run? Right?
Yeah.
So I mean, like everything goes through the Suez Canal because nobody wants to run fiber in Iraq and there are big mountains in Russia, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean those stories. I mean the ones that are most specific are told by the man sitting over there. Where'd he go? Oh, he left. Oh, there he is. There he is. Yo Whitman, who's head of the Amsterdam Internet Exchange. I mean, Amsterdam's a small country with a lot of internet. And some of the kind of geopolitical and commercial reasons for why some places become internet hubs more than others are really interesting. And that kind of large-scale sort of the topographical issues, I mean, like the Suez, like the crazy overland cables from Asia to Europe, are definitely a big part of it. I mean, the big issue now, I guess, is the new transatlantic cables from the southern hemisphere, which is sort of the flip side of not wanting to go through Iraq, I guess. So.
I just want, sorry, I'll stand.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's an interesting commentary that the building 350 East Cermak was originally the R.R. Donnelley Printing Company.
Yeah.
So you have a print media building that has now become the center of digital media for most of the Midwest. And the digital media, a lot of the reason for that building over other buildings, if you don't know, is the floor loadings, the construction of the building itself makes it possible for companies like Telex and Equinix and others that are in that space to use that building. There are very few buildings in Chicago that exist that meet the requirements to house a data center facility. That's one of the few. It's just an interesting comment on the change over time.
Yeah, there was Kevin, who's in the video, who's in the back of the room someplace. There he is. Just did a post a couple weeks ago, going into some of the history of that. So.
You kind of mentioned about Google and their security. Have you found it's one extreme or the other as far as going into some of these facilities and getting tours and things like that? It's like at 350 Cermak, we can't even take pictures of our own equipment without getting somebody involved.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's It's changed. It's definitely changed. I mean, when I started looking at it, I mean, I went to NANOG in spring of 2009 in Philadelphia. Is that right? Yeah, spring of 2009 in Philadelphia, and there hadn't been a journalist in 8 years. Nobody had been. That's not the case now. That's certainly changed, and there hadn't been any culture of looking inside of these buildings. Another celebrity in the room, Melissa Miller, who was in the back, when I called, first said, "Okay, I'm supposed to do this piece for Wired, taking photographs inside the internet. You know, what's going on? You know, who are you working with that can allow photographs in?" And some of them were out of the question, and some of them said, "No, we can do this. We can figure it out." And the competition, the increasing competition over the last few years between the interconnection providers, between the data centers, between the cloud providers. I mean, obviously, the more competition there is, the more people want to tell their story. That's kind of self-evident. And so I think it is a lot more open now. I mean, a lot of my enthusiasm of you know, working on this video was, you mean we get to take a camera into the meet me room? Like, okay, let's do it. Because it's not a place that people have seen. But again, when there's the commercial imperative to tell these stories, the stories get told. And what's interesting as well is that now the consequence of that is to recognize not just the commercial needs, but also the political and social needs as well. Lunch? Okay.